landscape fire forest ecologist and has been studying fire and other disturbances. And tonight he's going to give us a overview of fire and fire regimes historically in our region and how that compares to what happens now with fires in our region. So, Paul.
As I go along, I'm going to try to define terms that are unique to forest ecology or fire ecology. And pop your hand up if I miss one as I go along, okay? I want to start out by bringing to light the fact that wildfires and the imagery associated with them invoke imagery of battles and battlefields and battle tactics. And what I want to do is I want to talk about the flip side of fire. You see battalions of people with all sorts of aircraft and hoses and incredible courage battling wildfires. And what I want to ask tonight is the question of whether or not it's always been like that and whether it needs to be like that. This has hit a little bit closer to home recently with the Carlton complex. As Julie said, it's a fire of massive proportions, over 250,000 acres, 400 square miles burned, several hundred structures were destroyed, lives were broken, livelihoods were interrupted, incredible mess. And you got a first-hand view of what wildfire can do to a community. But it wasn't always like this. For thousands of years, historians suspect for 8,000 to 10,000 years before the current era, Aboriginals throughout North America, Native Americans in the United States here set fires, especially to the grasslands, the shrublands, and the dry forests of eastern Washington, in fact, throughout the western United States, as these old paintings portray. And the subject of Indian burning is a topic of immense interest, and there are many books written on it. If you're at all interested, I can give you some titles. But they did it for an awful lot of reasons, not the least of which was that wildfires during the fire season were really a scary prospect. They also managed the grasslands and forests for offense and defense and warfare, for food production, for an incredible variety of reasons. And while historical accounts and debates rage on about how much Indian burning there was, chances are excellent, especially in the grasslands and the dry forests, it increased fire frequency by up to double natural fire frequency. So there's a lot of burning in the forest prior to 100 years ago, and it's only been about 100 years we've been putting fires out. Before that time, humans were making fire frequency much more frequent than it naturally occurred for thousands of years. So this is the ground I'd like to cover in my talk. I would like to talk about historical fire regimes and natural forest succession and some of the real key linkages. A fire regime is the frequency and severity, the extent and the seasonality of fires. All of those characteristics taken together form the regime. Natural forest succession is essentially the life history of patches of forest, from birth to death and back again to rebirth again. There's some really powerful linkages that I want to go over that are super important. I want to show how management has altered fire regimes and the structure and the composition and the patterns of forests. And that's produced some really significant changes in landscape functioning, and it's happened in a little over 100 years. And I'd like to close with some key principles that emerge from our study of these key changes. Fires across eastern Washington and elsewhere in the West form an incredible complexity in their severity. That is, how much vegetation is killed by fire. But they're binned so we can talk about them and do work and do study with them. But they really reflect a continuum of conditions. Low severity fires are said to be fires that occur really quite frequently, and less than 20% of the vegetation is killed in each occurrence of fire, each instance of fire. And on the other end are these high severity fires where more than 70 or 75% of all the vegetation is killed each instance of fire. And in the middle is this really strange, confusing bin mixed severity fire where a little bit to a lot might be killed by a combination of low severity and high severity fires. Low severity fires occur as very low severity because they're typically supported by very frequent ignitions, very frequent fires. And contrary-wise, high severity fires are mostly infrequent, so fuel accumulates, and when fires happen, they tend to be quite severe. And mixed severity fires can be moderately frequent to moderately infrequent, and as a result, they produce mixed effects. Here's a couple of pictures, Connie. I think this is you in this slide. This is on the upper right there are flame lengths that would be typical of a low severity fire. Because fires happen frequently, fuel is consumed often, and so there's not a lot of heat energy released each time there's a fire, so the flame lengths aren't that long, and fire intensity is fairly low. And as a consequence, most of the trees survive the fire. It's fires that grow on the surface of the forest floor, mostly consuming surface fuels. And so you can see in this upper left, this is the aftermath of a fire that was low severity. And this right here is Leecher Mountain near you. This is a historical shot from the 1930s of this from the Leecher Mountain overlook. And you can see what I want to show you here is on the south-facing slopes how open and sparsely wooded they were. And on the north-facing slopes, the fires were frequent enough that they weren't dense, closed canopy forest conditions. So these kinds of forest conditions that had low severity fire were much more open canopy, and they supported fire-tolerant tree species like thick bark chondrose pine and Douglas fir. Here's the opposite extreme. High severity fires where more than 70% of the tree cover is killed by fire. You can see flame lengths can be 50 to 200 or 300 feet in length. These are really severe affairs, and there's a phenomenal amount of fuel consumed. And what's distinctive about a high severity fire is that it's very often continuous burning from the surface fuels to the canopies, and quite often the fire will run through the canopies, producing the effects you see here on the upper left, where the canopies of the stands are actually consumed by fire. In this bottom photo here, this is from Bethel Ridge. This is west of Natchez, Washington, east of Rainier, north of Rimrock Lake. And this is an area of moist mixed conifer forest and subalpine forest. And what I want to show you here is that in these forests there was a heck of a lot of high severity fire. You can see all sorts of age classes of forest exist in this particular view. In this kind of forest type, a lot of fire and a lot of patches of forest at different sizes and ages and density was the norm. 30-40% of that forest would be in young conditions, quite commonly. I'm going to show you a slide of that same condition today. It'll blow your mind. These are the mixed severity fires where you have surface fires and crown fire in the upper right there. And they produce mixed effects. So you see patches, small patches of trees that are burned out, areas that are underburned, areas that survive. And so you end up seeing as little as a quarter of the vegetation consumed to sometimes half or more of it. This is the Liberty Beehive area from the 1930s right here. It was an area that had quite a bit of mixed severity fire. Okay, another concept that I want to introduce you to is the fact that fire regime, and I'm going to unpack different kinds of regimes a little bit more here, they were kind of zoned by forest type. And so one of the things I want you to do is just look at the map of fire regime groups here. So these are benign fires going to high severity fires in dark red here. And take a look at the land cover map here, and you can see that the life form and the fire regime were sort of synonymous. Fire regimes were really influenced by gradients of elevation, by land surface forms, by climate zonation, by precipitation and temperature regimes. And so there's actually kind of a logic to how fire regimes occur across the landscape. One of the keys about those fire regimes and the linkage with climate and productivity and elevation is that the fire regime ends up sort of equilibrating with its environment and its climate conditions. One of the problems that I'm going to show you today is that the vegetation on those same landscapes is not equilibrated with its climate regime and its environments. There's a lot more vegetation. We sort of describe it sometimes as an epidemic of trees across the landscape under this period of fire suppression and fire exclusion. Okay, I'm gonna break down some of the fire regime areas that are relevant to Eastern Washington. This fire regime group 5 is mostly high severity fire, and there's very often more than 200 years, up to 1,000, 1,200 years in some locations, really wet locations between fires. So that's an incredibly long period of time to grow fuels. You can see the Cascade Crest and the rain shadow to the east of that Cascade Crest. This fire regime group 5 occurs in that red area in the headlands of those watersheds. You can see the Smelkameen at the top there, and the headlands of the Methow, and the Chelan and Entiat, and the Wenatchee, and the upper Yakima, and the Natchez as you go down there. So those fire regimes occurred in those forests. And here's what some of those forest types look like that were associated with the fire regime. Douglas fir, western hemlock, western red cedar, Pacific silver fir, noble fir, mountain hemlock, subalpine fir, and Engelmann spruce. And when we say that they are mostly high severity fires, I put a little simple histogram there to show you that the fire regime isn't just high severity where everything gets killed. It's mostly high severity, but sometimes other kinds of fires happen which produce more complexity in the resulting forest structure. So there is a little bit of low and there is a little bit of mixed severity mixed in there. Fire regime group 4, this is also high severity, between 35 and about 200 years between fires. This is this area in the darkest orange, and this is the shrub stepplands east of the Cascade Crest in the rain shadow. This is the Columbia Plateau country. These fire regimes are also common to some of the high elevation cold forests. So here's some shots of some example systems where you find this fire regime: sagebrush, mountain mahogany, bitterbrush, greasewood communities, and then some of the spruce fir and lodgepole pine. And again, mostly high severity, but also some other low and mixed severity fires like I showed you before, smattered in there. Fire regime group 3. Is there a question? Fire regime group 3 is this medium orange color that you can see, and there's actually quite a bit of real estate in that color. The areas that have that are the rain shadow forest and woodlands of the Olympic Peninsula, Puget lowland forest, and on the east side, dry and moist mixed conifer forests and eastern Washington shrublands. Can you make out this color here? So it's this area right here. Very, very significant real estate in some of the watersheds. Here's some examples of those forest vegetation types. These are Doug fir, ponderosa pine, western larch, grand fir forests. And when we say it's mostly low and mixed severity fire, that little histogram in the upper right corner gives you an idea that it's not just one kind of fire happening, but there's actually quite a complexity. And what does that mean? It means that sometimes the fires will start a patch of forest over again and create a new forest. Sometimes it'll just thin it from below. Sometimes it'll punch holes in it. But that kind of complexity was very important to the forest. This is fire regime group 2. This is pretty cool. It's associated with relic grasslands of eastern Washington. Down in the lower corner there you can see this was mostly high severity and fires could be quite frequent. I just wanted to draw your attention to, these are the old Palouse prairies, which are now dry land, wheat farmed, and center pivot, potatoes, and other truck crops. But this used to be an enormous ecosystem that had this prairie ecosystem that had these very frequent fires. And there are efforts underway now to try to restore some of it, actually. Fire regime group 1, there's an awful lot of fire regime group 1 in this part of the world. It's this very lightest yellow color right here that you can see. You can see throughout the east side, this is the one that's associated with the dry pine, the dry mixed conifer forest, the open pine woodlands, and then some of the dry shrub steplands.
Can you identify some of the traffic points there?
Yeah, you betcha. I'd be happy to. Okay, so here's the Methow drainage. This is the Methow watershed. This is the Cascade Crest up here. This is the Chelan Basin. There's the Entiat. Here's the Wenatchee. Okay. And the Columbia River is right here. Okay.
A question?
Yeah.
Are these years between fires, are they characteristic of both pre and post-Columbian era?
No, this is recent. This is sort of pre-settlement era. But the fire regime over thousands of years changed spectacularly, actually, with huge changes in the life form and the species composition. Over thousands of years of deeper time depths, you'd see huge changes in biogeography and then changes in fire regime associated with that. And these are shots of some of the forest conditions that are associated with this fire regime group 1. And here you can see this is where most of the low severity fire and mixed severity fire tended to be on the low side as well. So in these types, an awful lot of forests survived the fires and got thinned from below. Here's an example from the Fisher Fire on the Wenatchee National Forest. Another question? No? All right, so the next couple slides I want to go into start to talk about how these fires work together to form a mosaic of conditions within a large landscape context. So I talked about wildfires a lot, and a lot of differences in low, mixed, and high severity regimes, and how that was zoned with different forest vegetation types. I don't want to oversimplify the story. There are dozens of native insects and pathogens that also were creating disturbances. And there were weather events that were also creating disturbances at the same time. Historically, it seems like wildfires were probably carrying most of the water, and these other were subordinate to fires, at least most of the time. And one of the things that we're finding out about those fires is that before the era of suppression, we used to have fire sizes that were shaped, fire size distributions that were shaped in a distribution like this. What does that mean? It means there were a lot of small fires and very few really big fires. But the big fires burned most of the area all the time, so it's not a big deal that fires are big right now. Most of the landscape was always burned by big fires. You can imagine that a fire that's 200,000 or 300,000 hectares in this particular situation, even though it's fairly rare, it's burning a lot of real estate compared to lots of fires over here that are burning tens to hundreds of hectares at any one time. What's really changed is that the variability and severity within those perimeters has changed tremendously as a consequence of fire explosion. And this right here shows the distribution of fire sizes during the suppression era. So far fewer of these little guys and more area burned in these large wildfires. And this is a pretty significant change. I'm going to show you sort of a natural resilience mechanism that came out of this distribution of patch sizes. Imagine a handful of really big fires influencing the landscape, and then thousands of small fires dappled over time within that. You can see that as the large fire burned landscape grows up, there's tremendous connectivity of the forest through that. And the small fires that occur in that landscape are responsible for controlling fires to go out naturally. Fires run into those small patches and they go out. And what's neat about this distribution is that it was self-perpetuating. That blue distribution, it was the natural resilience mechanism of the forest. Is that making sense to you? So essentially this patchwork of vegetation was influential to basically causing fires to go out. I'll walk you through that here. Wildfire patterns in the natural landscape provided this sort of positive feedback mechanism which we call resilience. They maintain patchworks of burned and recovering vegetation in a variety of successional stages and sizes, such that when fires were ignited, they couldn't move throughout the entire forest because places had already burned, and fires would run into them and they would go out. Insect and disease and weather disturbances, they added to this complexity. And these patchworks, this mosaic of size and age and structural conditions, spatially interrupted the conditions that supported large fires. So it was actually this mechanism that kept the frequency of these big guys low. Okay, so it's sort of a patchwork influencing the frequency, size, and severity of future events. And then extreme climate and weather events would occasionally override these spatial controls, and that's what caused the really big fires in this particular distribution. All right. There were also positive patch scale feedbacks too. Remember I showed you that a lot of the landscape had low and mixed severity fire in it, and these fires at a patch level, they reduced surface fuels because they were happening so frequently, and they were consuming the fuels regularly so they didn't accumulate. And this is what produced the shorter flame lengths and fewer trees that were torching out. Torching is when there's connectivity between the canopy and the fuels burning on the ground, and fire will transmit to the canopies as a result of that. When you have these frequent fires, they're actually scorching the crown bases and they're elevating those crowns, so it takes longer flames to actually get up into the crowns. So that's one of the feedbacks. These low and mixed severity fires that are pretty frequent, they increase the height to the live crowns, which I just described, and that reduced the potential for fire burning the crowns. By killing a handful of trees all the time, they reduced crown density. Why is this important? Imagine a canopy being like an umbrella, and if you were to put an umbrella over a fire, a campfire, it would trap a lot of heat, and eventually it would start to melt the umbrella. But if there are all sorts of holes in the canopy, that heat is released and it's not trapped, so it's more difficult for crown fire to initiate. These fires favored early cereal tree species. What does that mean? Trees that can stand, that grow up with and have a life history with fire. So ponderosa pine, western larch in particular, they grow very, very thick bark at the base. They can handle a tremendous amount of heat and they can survive fire. So these species were favored, and medium and large sized trees of these species were favored because the bigger they are, the thicker the bark gets. And these frequent, yep.
I have a question about the crown decrease in crown density. So the fires would reach the crowns, punch holes in the crown, but not start, I think crowding is just going lickety-split from crown to crown to crown.
Yeah, so they would do it usually by a mechanism that's called passive crown fire. And I think Connie's going to be talking to you, are you going to be talking about mistletoe and how mistletoe caused torching? Well, so there are a number of ways that some tree species have branches that go all the way to the ground, and they'll torch out quite often when you have a surface fire. Mistletoes maintain a really thick grooming structure, and they cause torching quite often. So you'll see trees being eliminated, individual trees and small clumps of trees being eliminated in a low severity fire by this torching mechanism quite often. Okay?
So it isn't just surface, it's getting to the crown, but
You bet.
only to a limited extent.
Remember I showed that low severity fires, up to 20% of the trees can be killed.
Yeah.
And they're not being killed in one fell swoop. They're being nickeled and dimed here and there all the time. And so that's punching holes in the canopy, thinning it, if you will. Okay, and these fires, the last feedback is they favored patchy tree cover and surface fuel cover. So trees didn't grow everywhere evenly. An area would be killed, there'd be some mineral soil exposed, trees would regenerate in that patch, and so you'd see this kind of ongoing patchy regeneration of the forest. And if you were to check the birthdays in a 100-hectare forest that's influenced like this, you'd see continuous regeneration of that patch by these low severity fires. Many, many cohorts, many age cohorts. Alrighty, there's been a lot written about what changed, and all I want to be able to do here is just sort of highlight some of the key changes. And the first and most important one is during the 1800s, the Indians were marshaled onto reservations, and this caused a cessation in higher frequency burning that was going on at that time. It abruptly stopped as a consequence of that. In some places, that was a significant change in the fire ecology. The landscape was crisscrossed by roads and railroads, and you can imagine if fires are conveyed in the grass and shrub fuels across the landscape, when they hit a road, that's a heck of a fuel break. So roads broke up the continuity of fires. Subdividing by ownership was really significant. Livestock grazing, they were grazing the flashy fuels, so that had a huge influence on fire spread. They were being eaten and digested instead of carrying fire. Fire prevention and suppression during the 30s that started, and it was very successful for many decades. Urban and rural development, basically taking grasslands and dry forests and woodlands out of production, and then, as I showed earlier, extensive agriculture. The main changes were tremendous forest fragmentation, simplified structure. Obviously, the target of timber harvest was to get the larger sized trees, the commercially desirable species, and so that put a heavy influence on taking the largest, oldest trees, and that created an intermediate age forest that dominated. The desirable species were pine and larch and western white pine, and they were removed in a tremendous number of Doug fir and grand fir, white fir, subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce. They regenerated and released as those holes were made. There's a large increased vulnerability to fires, insects, and pathogens as a result of these changes. And I'll show you that the reduction in grasslands and shrublands in forest, and by this I mean places that are capable of growing forest, but we're actually growing grass and shrubs, changed really significantly. I'll show you some slides, and that changed the mosaic a lot. And then obviously the roads that were produced fragmented the fish networks, and it reduced fish and fish habitat. All right, I'm going to show you some slides that are basically a cartoon of some of the changes. These are from about 400 pairs of watersheds that we reconstructed over the last 20 years throughout the interior Columbia Basin using early and late 20th century aerial photography. Here's an example of significant change in increase in forest cover and a loss of grassland. Grassland is in this yellow color, forest is in the green color, and you can see that over a period of about 80 years in this watershed, forest encroached on areas that had formerly been maintained in grasslands. And this is actually fairly common. Within the Blue Mountains, for example, Blue Mountains ecosystem, the dry pine and dry mixed conifer systems, about a quarter of that landscape historically was maintained in grass, not in forest, on the dry aspects. And since then, it's been colonized by forest. So the mosaic of grass and forest system has really changed tremendously. And in the case of this previous slide, you can see that the watershed went from a grass-dominated to a forest-dominated watershed. This is Libby Creek and Gold Creek area. This slide is to show you the loss of old forests, which were strongly topographically controlled. They were in headwaters regions and valley bottoms. Old forest is the blue shaded patches that you see there. And new forest, stuff that's regenerated by fire, is in that light red, pink color there. You can see the loss of old forest in that watershed in about 75 years. And what remains in the present day is a lot more intermediate aged forest, shown in the colors of green and yellow. Old forests were also under strong topographic control. These are old park-like stands here in light blue, and these are old multi-story stands. These are hit by fire constantly. These get fire rarely in the dark blue. But they commonly occurred on north aspects, and in particular valley bottom or stream confluence zones, and so you can see that between the historical and the current rendering, the old forest not only disappeared, but it doesn't exist in those topographic settings anymore. Why is that relevant? In frequently fired landscape, one has to ask themselves the question, how do forests get old? How do they get centuries old? But as it turns out, there's an awful lot of topographic features that contribute to time since fire. And being next to scree slopes and next to stream confluences, things like that, and in valley bottoms allows forest patches to miss fires recurrently so that they get old. So being in a fire-prone forest, old forest lives in particular habitats. When you're not talking about old forests, one of the other things that we noticed is that regardless of the age class of the forest, residual medium and large trees were a very common component of the forest. So even if it wasn't old growth, there were a lot of large trees that were scattered throughout the overstory. And this is another really large and remarkable change. Fire-tolerant cover types, what does that mean? So remember I told you that ponderosa pine is tolerant of fire. Ponderosa pine in this slide on the left here is shown in the light green. And you can see that when you're just looking at the cover species, there's a lot of ponderosa pine in this particular watershed. This is grand fir patches. These are on north aspects in valley bottom, shaded, cool environments. You can see all the grand fir is in a place where it's basically cooler and wetter environment. This is all grassland in this particular brown color. So if you were to look at just the grassland and the ponderosa pine, you can see this watershed was dominated by just those two conditions. This watershed 80 years later, you can see ponderosa pine is barely present. The grasslands have been colonized by Douglas fir in this light blue and grand fir forest. And these are shade-tolerant, very fire-intolerant species. This happens to be the pea vine watershed on the Walla Walla Ranger District in southeastern Washington. And this watershed I'm going to show you in a couple of slides is ready to burn coast to coast. It's in serious trouble.
Was this 100 years ago, historical?
This is less than 100. And this is an unlogged patch of forest on the Chelan Ranger District here. And what I wanted to, so it's never been logged. And this is just the encroachment of trees. This right here, this tree here, and this tree here in the background were the only three trees in this view that existed 100 years ago. The rest of these trees have all grown in the absence of fire. And here's what it looks like in a cartoon map. This is the same watershed I showed you. Now we're looking just at structural conditions. What you used to have was an all-age forest mosaic, many different sizes and ages associated with that species composition that I showed you before. Patches were small to very large. Now you can see that this green here is young forest multi-story, so it's dense, multi-layered, full of the fire-tolerant Douglas fir and grand fir that I showed you before, and it's a habitat for western spruce budworm and fir and gray brigade. So increased canopy layers, increased tree canopy cover, change to fire-intolerant species. These overstories that were remnants in a variety of different structural conditions, and they're named here. Stand initiation, this is new forest. Stem exclusion, open and closed canopy conditions. Understory reinitiation. These are basically structural conditions as the forest matures. You can see when you take these large trees off, the landscape, the forest starts to look like this without the large trees, and that's basically what happened.
Oh, do you want those lights on or
Julie,
off?
take them down again, thanks.
Yeah, we can go down again.
Sorry. Okay.
You have a question back here, Paul.
Yeah.
Can you explain again how the reduction in fires has meant fewer large mature trees in some forests?
The reduction in large trees has been caused by timber harvest.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, there was tremendously high timber harvest levels, and so they removed most of the trees that are, 20 inches, 30 inches, 40 inches in diameter. Okay, is that clear to everybody? All right, thanks for the question. Okay, here's that watershed that we saw before, and there's a lot going on here, but actually the message is really quite simple. So this is a historical rack of this same watershed. Just look at the complex mosaic of forest structure. You don't even have to know what the names are. And you see this is greatly simplified structure. This is the current situation. These are the fuel loads of the historical and current condition. Yellow is high, very high is orange, and severe is red. So hot colors, bad news, cool colors, good news, all right? So you can see how the complexity of the mosaic leads to complexity of the fuel pattern conditions, the crown fire potential, and the flame length. So it's not that the historical landscape didn't have the opportunity for high crown fire potential or high fuel loading conditions. They just weren't next to each other. They were spatially isolated. This pattern of the mosaic was a really robust pattern. So fires couldn't spread easily from one patch to the other because the patchwork was broken out. Now you can see that the fuel loading and the crown fire and flame length potential conditions are very much associated with the change in the forest structure and composition. And what's more, this particular watershed is next to other watersheds that look just like that. So the likelihood of having severe crown fires running over a large area is greatly expanded. So we've really rescaled the vulnerability of the landscape to severe fire. Patches were always vulnerable, but now landscapes and large groups of landscapes. Connie's going to go into this a lot more, but I wanted to show you how the patterns of structure and composition influence the vulnerability to insects like the western spruce budwig. This is a defoliator, it likes to eat buds and new foliage, causes this kind of damage on its host, the true firs and Douglas fir. And here's the range of this critter. So it's eastern Washington is fully within the range. It's a native insect. And this is from the Kettle River country. This is a watershed 80 years ago, and its vulnerability to spruce budworm. So it had conditions that could get defoliated, but it wasn't likely to be handed off by western spruce budworm, and that's no longer the case today. Patches that are vulnerable to western spruce budworm are right next to each other very often, and outbreak can be large and persistent. Here's an example of a bark beetle, mountain pine beetle. Mountain pine beetle is well within its range here, and you can see it's a native of eastern Washington. It mass attacks low vigor trees, and you can see it leads to widespread mortality. This is a part of a current outbreak in British Columbia that is, it's now over 25 million acres, isn't it, Connie?
Yeah.
25 million acres decimated by a beetle because the climate is warming, winter temperatures are not killing the beetle, and the age classes of lodgepole pine grew up and were synchronous throughout the process. Okay, so now you see how patches in that landscape would be vulnerable to a bark beetle, but in this particular case, outbreaks can get quite large as a result of the continuity of those conditions. All right, the next 6 slides I want to show you, to me they're pretty jaw-dropping. They're going to be from the 1930s to the current decade. This is Lookout Mountain near here. And I want to show you how much grass, open grass, and shrub area there was in the 1930s. And look at how trees have encroached on that landscape, and they're continuing to encroach. The bottom picture is a John Marshall picture. The top one is part of the Osborne panorama set. This is Leecher Mountain. You saw the historical one earlier from 1930. This is 2011 now. Look at how dense and continuous the forest is as a consequence of excluding fire. Can you all see that well?
Paul?
Yes.
Just to point out that, if you haven't looked at these pictures a lot, and I've seen this one from John before, it's almost worth pointing out that it's not just the fact that there's trees, but that they're much denser.
Yeah.
You can see, like in the one of the foreground ridges.
So are you able to see how, regardless of aspect, the densities have filled in the same areas? Peter. This is Mission Peak area. This is out the backside of just southwest of Wenatchee, a stone's throw. Here I want to show you the relationship to topography of the dry mixed conifer and dry pine forest. And you can see how the ridgetops and the south-facing aspects were very sparsely wooded. And this was maintained by the fire ecology. And you can see that if you're looking down on this landscape, half of it is sparsely wooded. So you're not going to have big running crown fire conditions. You're going to have low fuel levels and fires moving across the forest floor. You can see an awful lot of these areas here that were sparsely wooded are now densely wooded. And you can see bark beetle and defoliator mortality in the foreground patches there. This is up the Indiat. This is Duncan Hill, Duncan Ridge area. This is a spectacular panorama. And what you can see in this panorama is an incredible amount of young forest, and forest of really, recently cleared by fire or very young. For example, take a look at this area right here, this area right here, in this photo. You can see that that was recently decimated by a fire in this 1934 view. And if you look around the landscape, you'll see patches like that all over the place. And you'll see when you look at this landscape now that it was a carpet of trees, and there's tremendous beetle mortality in these areas that grew up and didn't have any other disturbance to thin them out. Yes? This is up the Indiat drainage. Yeah.
So when you present this 1934 picture, is that supposed to represent what it was more or less like for hundreds of years before that?
Probably hundreds, but not thousands. That's right. This is a forest and fire ecology coming off of a little ice age in the Cascade Mountain Range. And so these were the regimes that were adjusted to that climate area. If I would go back 2,500 or 4,500 years, it'd be a very different look altogether. Yep. There, hit the right button, hello. Okay, this is the Slate Peak area, 16 miles northwest of Mazama. Same kind of story here. Take a look at how much fire there is in this landscape. I think the batteries are out. Yeah, but you can see the areas that are really low stature trees, areas that have been recently had the trees removed in the middle ground, the foreground, and background. You see a carpet of trees returning. Yeah.
The last one. In the bottom right corner of the last one,
Yeah.
the trees were actually gone in the more recent photo,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah.
What do you think happened there?
Likely fire. Likely fire. Good eye. Way better. This is the Bethel Ridge area. I showed you a picture of the high severity fires that were distributed across that landscape. Just notice how varied the age structure is of that forest. This is subalpine forest and moist mixed conifer. And look at the current view, how dense and continuous that forest is. And you can notice the bark beetle mortality and skeletal remains of previous bark beetle mortality in the foreground there. Alrighty. I want to offer four what I think are core principles that emerge from our study of these changes, and offer them as food for our discussion. First one is that fire and forest succession are the engine that drives the system. If you restore the fire regime and the supportive successional patterns, the other disturbance regimes will follow. So it's basically the engine. If it's out of whack, the system stays out of whack. Recall that by regime I mean restoring the frequency, severity, extent, the seasonality, and then the variability of these factors. Okay, the historical regimes expressed the climate variation and varying fire severity and patch sizes I showed you earlier on. And so this resulted in this highly varied successional pattern. And it was these patterns themselves that promoted the fire regime and its variability. That's what's out of whack. That successional mosaic. Okay? You can see it with the right button up low. Okay, the second principle. Predictable distributions of severity patches emerge from linked climate disturbance and topography interactions with vegetation. So these fire size and fire severity patch size distributions become critical. If you restore these, you restore the fire regime. And I want to make an argument that it's not going to happen with thinning and burning. It's not happening fast enough. Wildfires are carrying all the water right now. This is the Okanagan and Wenatchee National Forest data, including the Carlton Complex. And what you're looking at is a graph of acres burned by prescribed fires in blue and acres burned by wildfires in red. The y-axis is acres in thousands, so it's 0 to 600,000 acres. The time span is 2005 to 2014. If you look at that pie diagram down there, wildfires are burning about 5 times as many acres as we're burning with prescribed burning and thinning right now. I'm going to show you something else that really sharpens this up. This is from a really cool paper by Jeremy Littell and others, 2009, where they look at the provinces in the West. And they show how area burned was large, kind of like it is right now, before fire suppression. And then there's 50 years where we really thought we could put fires out. That's the suppression era, when we thought we had the technology. About 1985 is when we stopped effectively controlling acres burned with fire suppression. I think Richie's going to talk to you about another way to live with fire besides suppression. What I'd like to argue with these data is that the fires that we're putting out right now, that are simple to put out when the weather's benign, putting out 98% of all fires right now, those are the fires that we want to carry the water for us. So it's literally the anti-recipe. What we really want to be able to do is to have fires burning that landscape. All right. Regional landscapes. This is the third core principle. Regional landscape function as multi-level, cross-connected patchwork hierarchies. If you restore connectivity in these multi-level landscapes, you restore the functionality that's broken right now. What does that mean? Harvests that occurred in a stand here and a stand there, they unwittingly broke up the connectivity of habitats, big networks of habitats that were highly functional. We didn't understand that what we did locally in a watershed influenced the larger landscape. What you're looking at here is the Blue Mountains province in northeastern Oregon, and landscapes that are nested inside of each one of this. This is Fields Creek watershed that burned, and it burned very, very hot and severely. And you can see that these patches now are breaking up a part of this landscape at a province level. So even though we broke the landscape up a patch at a time, a stand at a time, the repair strategy for the landscape is essentially in reverse, to reconnect the very large landscapes. So we have to ask questions when we're acting locally. How does this improve connectivity of owl habitat, bear habitat, wolf habitat, whatever? Final principle, topography provides a template for vegetation and habitat patterns. In the map on the right side there, you can see, got a little bit left in here. South aspects are in the light red, north aspects are in the light blue here, valley bottoms are in the dark blue, and ridge tops are in the dark red. So this is essentially a map made in a GIS of north-facing, south-facing ridge and valley settings. And we find that the fire regimes and the veg conditions very much honored the topography. And so the topography offers us a way of being able to tailor in these characteristics back to the landscape again. So we can use it as a template. All right, takeaway messages. Healthy forests and ranges include much burned area. A third or more of the landscape is in new forest, areas that have been regenerated by fire or thinned by fire. This burned area pattern is the key to resilient landscapes. It's the primary thing that's changed in our landscapes. I'd like to suggest that if we restore the natural fire regimes and the supportive successional patterns, we move back in the direction of wildfire and climate resilient landscapes. We can do that by tailoring successional patterns and patches to the topography. I'd like to acknowledge John Marshall for the landscape photos and Brian Salter, my geographer, for the maps in this presentation. And at this point, Julie, we've got time for questions galore. All right, questions?
Can you speak on any particular fires from here? Particularly interested in the Little Bridge Creek fire, which was the later fire developed to take any structures, but it was threatening homes and pine forest and along the Twist River. And it seemed to be a mixed severity fire, you know, number one. That was the first question. Number two, was it maybe fought in a way that you might prescribe, i.e. there was some fighting of it so it wouldn't reach over into pine forest, and there was a lines developed along the Twist River, but otherwise I think it was just sort of right its way. It was sort of, maybe you know more about it.
I don't. John, you want to speak to it? Susan, do you know that fire under the hood?
I know that it was, constrained by topography. Back in 2006, we had the State Creek fire. Same thing where I know the fire managers knew that the fire was going to burn up into rocks in some areas, and so that topography was going to really help. So that's my guess.
Richie's going to be here, what, the last session? It'd be good to pocket that question and ask him to unpack it. In fact, Julie, it might be good to actually make a note of that and ask Richie if he could bring that burn severity map and maybe some of the day-to-day reports on fire attack to see whether or not we could answer that in particular.
I guess that, and as a follow-up to that, it seemed to me that the Little Bridge Creek fire might be a little bit of a model for what you're talking about, where you're faced with having to protect structures which are quite nearby, but it's in an environment where you could successfully permit it to go to a certain extent to create the natural conditions that you're looking for.
We've actually got a number of fires that have burned a lot like we've wanted them to burn, where 75–80% of it burned beautifully. And the districts are doing a heck of a lot of work to try to fireproof the areas around the urban interface to the best of their ability and use those as anchors to burn off of, and then manage the fire adjacent to areas they've already treated. Ideally, what we really want to be able to do is in areas where we've treated, continue to come back and burn them at regular intervals so that the cumulative area that we're treating every year gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is the thing that we're hampered from doing because of the smoke management regulations are so tight. I think Richie will probably talk about this in his talk, but my guess is on an average year, somewhere between 60 and 80% of the acres that we prepare to burn, we don't get to burn because we don't get a large enough window in the airshed to be able to make smoke. This is a non-trivial factor. This means we're accumulating acres not burned that are prepared to burn, and so it means we're not able to get ahead of the problem because we can't make smoke. And by making smoke, I'm not just saying let's make smoke and ignore the human health effects. The prescribed burning saves an incredible amount of smoke. Half or more of the human health affecting smoke can be saved by burning a prescription rather than having smoke produced during a wildfire. So there's a tremendous smoke benefit. I'll boil it down this way. If prescribed burning was done in place of the wildfires every decade for the next 100 years, you'd save at least half of the smoke every single decade that's deleterious to human health, and it could be more. That's a really big number. Yeah, Peter.
You used the word connectivity a lot, but it seemed that it was sort of, you blow hot and cold with it. So you're showing us these pictures where the land's kind of scabby from 1934, and now we have this blanket of trees, and you're teaching us that that's too dense. But I think of connectivity as being a habitat that goes a long ways. When you see a carpet of trees, you have a single habitat that goes a long ways. So don't you have more connectivity in that sense than when you have it all broken up into multiple mosaics, as you call it?
It's a great question. So every time, I'm going to take you to, is this landscape a good example?
Sure.
Could you drop the lights just for a second here? This is a really great question. So if you think about the successional mosaic, this patchwork I keep talking about, within young, intermediate age, and old patches of forest, there are species that make a living, but they don't make a living in the same habitats. So when there's a fire, and there's regeneration or thinning that goes on, there are winners and losers among the wildlife species and plant species, okay? Connectivity is not important from the standpoint of having habitat patches next to habitat patches next to habitat patches, but you want to be able to have them as close enough where the networking opportunities are good, they're reasonable. But you want to have enough variability in the mosaic so that all of the species have networking potential in the habitats they make a living in. So what would be a contrasting example? Spotted owl makes a living in old forests and late successional forests, deep, dark, multi-layered, closed canopy conditions. But woodpeckers and the blackback woodpeckers and sapsuckers like dead trees. They like mixed and high severity fires where snags were made, and they can bang a hole in a snag. And so they're losers in the highly connected late successional landscape. So what you really want to be able to do is to have this mosaic of patch conditions that's dynamically changing over space and time, and networking opportunities for each of these kinds of habitats. So that's the kind of connectivity we're talking about. So in a landscape like this, a variety of species are able to make a living because they can find adequate connections in their kind of habitat. Does that make sense?
Perfect.
All right. Yes?
Yeah, I kind of ahead here, I have trouble with the word, the succession.
Okay.
What you mean by that, because is it a historical succession or is it a plant growth succession? In other words, as we go from one slide here to the other, obviously this is filled in, that's a kind of succession.
Right.
That isn't the desirable one. We want the patchwork, right?
So succession is it's a kind of a compound notion in ecology. From birth to death, there's a succession of things that happen in the life history of a patch of forest.
Okay.
Okay? So let's say that a patch of forest is killed by a fire. Most of the trees die, and grasses and shrubs show up within a year or two, and you start to see vegetation reclaim the land. That's the early seral stage of that succession. And over time, conifer seeds, land, seedlings start to grow, and they start to overtake the shrubs. So you have the succession of a new forest beginning. Eventually they'll shade out the grasses and shrubs, and they'll start to develop more and more height, interlocking crowns, and you start to see this young forest developing. So the succession is the succession of species, size, and age. It's like birthdays of a forest patch. It's the life history of a patch of forest. And that's in change in species composition, size, age, density, and it's determined by disturbances. A lack of disturbances allow it to keep getting older and denser and more layered. But if you have frequent fires of low and mixed severity happening, it gets knocked backwards in succession to a more open, more early seral, more fire-tolerant condition. And that's the interplay between this mosaic of successional conditions and the disturbances. Does that help?
Yeah, I keep wondering what happens when you go in and clear cut.
Well, a lot of things happen.
I mean,
I see a copy. Look at those two photos. The bottom photo is a carbon dioxide sink, correct? You got more trees, you got more carbon dioxide absorption, which creates a mitigation against what we're doing to the air. Isn't it better to create more forest, more trees, to counterbalance?
That's a fabulous question. Sometimes and sometimes not is the answer. If your goal is to produce a carbon neutral forest condition over a multi-century time scale, the bottom condition won't give it to you. Because what's going to happen is you're going to have boom and bust conditions where you grow carbon and then you lose carbon as a consequence of fire. And so one of the things that makes more sense is to actually restore those mosaic conditions that allow you to be able to have much smaller changes over time, and the net carbon stored over very long time horizons is actually higher. So what you avoid is these great declines in carbon storage as a result of having a fire regime out of whack. So it's a fantastic question, and ecologists are struggling with how to do that right now without putting in a ton of extra CO2 in the air as a result of doing this. And they want to do that in storing carbon in the soil, and they want to do it in storing carbon in char and logs on the ground and in living trees. So what they're trying to do is solving for those pools of carbon right now and produce a net, more stable carbon condition in western forests rather than the boom and bust cycle that we're facing right now. It's a fantastic question, yeah.
I'm really curious about this trend was seen in the 80s to be showing that, okay, suppressing fire isn't turning out to be all that we thought it was. And that's 30 years ago, 35 years ago. Can you tell me some about how science is impacting policy, especially in regards to smoke management regulations? Like what have been the successes, and what do you see the future looking like over the next decade or so with changing policy with the science that's available now and in the next decade?
I think the science is amassing for not only with this gentleman's question about how to store carbon intelligently, but how to hedge your bets with forests and climate change. Increasingly, the focus is on figuring out ways to release the least amount of smoke with the greatest amount of advantage. And what we're finding out right now is that agencies are not having the success that they need with smoke management authorities in, for example, in Oregon and Washington. And I think that the big change is going to come when citizens say, we want less smoke that's harmful to human health. And we'll get it not by wildfires, but by prescribed burning. One of the things that prescribed burning managers can do is they can burn conditions when the atmospheric conditions are right, and so they can get the fire to burn just as hot as they want over an area that they want it to burn, and get the smoke up and out in the atmosphere, get it high in the atmosphere. None of those things are possible with the narrow window that we have with smoke management right now and the acres that we have to burn. So agencies right now have made an impact on the EPA smoke authorities, but we haven't had a successful conversation with the Department of Ecology in Washington State, which is actually reducing its thresholds of acceptable smoke. So smoke management's tightening up.
So how do you see turning that around? Like is it a political issue? Is it I'm looking for
It's a hugely
some
political
insight
issue.
into how you go about the change in policy.
It's an irrational political issue. If I were to cartoon, this is cocktail talk, but if I was to cartoon the question, I would say the question is, how do you want your smoke? Because you can't avoid the fact that you're going to get a bunch of it. And you would say to me, well, I want the best outcome on the land and the best human health outcome. And I would say to you, then you probably want to do a lot more prescribed burning because the wildfires aren't going to get you there. But citizens aren't speaking up, And what's happening right now is that when agencies go to smoke management units, they just hear no.
I was going to just mention that prescribed fires are heavily regulated, as you mentioned. Wildfires right now get a free pass. They are not counted
Right.
in the state air quality regulations.
Yeah, so the lid's off. So smoke is not smoke, as it turns out. So what management agencies are doing right now, I appreciate the prompt there, Susan. Since we're not doing bookkeeping on wildfire smoke, you see fire crews burning out as many acres as they possibly can during a wildfire in order to get as many acres treated because there's no accounting for smoke. If you stop and think about that, that's very perverse, isn't it?
Well, makes sense.
Yeah, but so folks are trying to get the ground burned, and so you see a lot of burnout operations going on, and in some places the outcomes are just spectacular, frankly. The burnout operations during the 2012 Wenatchee complex were nothing short of spectacular during that horrible inversion. Do you remember we were inverted all but 2 or 3 days? Half of the acres that were burned, probably. Wouldn't you guess, Connie? Half the acres were burnout operations, and the effect on the land was a great start. But we need to go back in 4 or 5 years and hit it again, and then hit it again, and that's what needs to happen. So smoke isn't smoke. Lawyers, environmental lawyers, are starting to write papers basically saying things like, smoke is smoke, and let's start finding out how we can manage the land effectively and produce the lowest smoke levels that are affecting human health.
So a good start would be getting this information out on a broader scale to the citizens to say, support prescribed burning and the smoke that comes with it, otherwise you're...
So some of us in this room have been working with air quality regulators. We've been going to their meetings and we've been making presentations on smoke trade-off between wild and prescribed fire, and the regulators are actually on board. It's policymakers who don't want to take the black eye, I believe, that are not making the choices. So we're rolling this powder keg forward, basically. Yes, sir.
So if you're able to deal with the policy makers and the regulators and change the smoke management by, 100%, 50%, would that begin to even reach anywhere into this 5-to-1 ratio?
When I talk to fire management officers on different districts across the east side in Oregon, Washington, and California, the figure that I hear from most of them is that I need to burn between 3 and 5 times as many acres every year as I'm currently burning to start making a big advance and get large anchor areas on the landscape where when you have wildfire ignitions, then you can do some really heavy work with the wildfire itself. But what they need to do is build these strongholds on the landscape all over the place so they can start working up against them. So we need a big unpacking of the smoke management regulations to do that.
Would you have the federal budget or the state budget to support the fire suppression managers? I mean the prescribed fire managers and the people on the ground to do that?
That's a great question, and the short answer is we're spending most of the money on the suppression side, and if we were to invert that and do it on the fuels management side, spend $1 billion a year in Oregon, Washington on fuels management, it would make a huge dent and it would happen fast. But right now, we're not even staffed to do it. We don't have the programs to do it. We'd have to literally rescale the agency's fuel management workforce in order to be able to do what's needed.
Jobs program.
It's a big deal. You're asking a really big question. John, do you have anything to add to that?
Actually, that'd be a good question to ask Richie when he's here. I think one thing I was just thinking about is, it's primarily federal agencies who are really the only prescribed burning to much extent. Your state agencies, like Washington DNR, in this area, they don't do prescribed burning. Actually, over when Dale Hessburg is here, he talked a lot about what he's been doing over at Cinnamon because he's actually burning on Washington Department of Wildlife land. So I think part of the stuff is like, just if the Forest Service alone or the Park Service or whatever, it's just gonna treat a portion of the landscape. And some of these things like the connectivity that Paul's been talking about, you know, you did, it's a real complicated thing, trying to make fire back. One of these, Paul, I was wondering about is if you might talk about using mechanical treatments as surrogates for fire effects. Because it seems like with this shift with the air quality stuff with the Forest Service, we're doing more mechanical treatments, so we're actually doing thinning with chainsaws, hand piling, and then burning the piles. And then sometimes we're actually doing this in conjunction with doing mechanical treatment first, and you know, thin, pile, burn. And we're not talking logging, we're just talking, we're cutting small trees, and then actually trying to follow up with the landscape underburn. So I don't know if you know, like talk a little bit about maybe some of these mechanical type treatments as a surge. For fire.
I'll start with the punchline. There's really no substitute for fire. If I were to describe Eastern Washington forests, they're forests born of fire. They're adapted to fire. The species, the communities are so fire adapted that they require fire regularly in their life history. That said, there is such an epidemic of trees in the understories of forest patches, and the fuels that are associated with them are very, very large volume of fuels. So it's in many areas it's hard to imagine being able to just use fire-only treatments to be able to make a dent fast enough. And so foresters throughout the east side are using combined thinning methods that John's alluding to, and stacking piles and burning. And I think the toolkit needs a combination of methods, frankly. I'm not a big fan of mastication. It works, but I think a lot of people are hating the community that comes back up underneath the mulch. But it's another method where they just basically bust up the fuels and scatter them and bury them in the soil with this masticator. I think there are stands that are amenable to fire-only treatments, but there are an awful lot of them that need to have either pre-commercial pile burning and oftentimes broadcast burning between the piles as well, and then other stands where that's just not going to get it done, where there's actually a need for an under-thinning, a commercial thinning, and then pile and burn piles and then broadcast burn. There's a need for an awful lot of assortments of treatments depending upon the stand conditions. So, yeah. But in the end, these forest communities really need the fire. The species absolutely depend on it. Yes?
So I'm listening to what you're saying, and like intellectually and conceptually it all makes sense, but I'm also thinking about the Carlton Complex fire and where it went, and it seems like when I look at that landscape, it was pretty patchy, you know, and it was a lot of different mosaics and age classes, and I actually moved here 4 years ago from Colorado, from Summit County, where it was like 90% mortality, you know, all even age trees, very homogeneous, you know, Route County, same way. And so for me, it was kind of weird in a way to see this area that is much more diverse, you know, in terms of ecosystems and age classes and all of that kind of stuff, and to see such a devastating fire in that context. Like Little Bridge Creek almost looks a little bit more like these areas, and there were a lot of different treatments in there, and it seemed like it acted more like a fire should, you know, but I guess I'm just...
This was a really extreme event. It burned in 2 days. Most of the fire burned, and under hellacious winds. I think, Susan, it was you that told me, it was you or somebody else tried to simulate the...
He was long-term analyst for the fire.
Was it fire analyst? Yeah. They simulated 2,000, was that it? 2,000 different events, and this event was only realized in 2 out of 2,000 simulations. Do I have that right? So it's basically a 99.99 percentile fire weather, extreme fire weather event. where the fire behavior is actually not so related in the rangelands to the initial conditions as it is the extreme winds and the drying and the burning environment. Okay? Now, where it burned in forest conditions, there was the setup for it, and the areas that I visited were set up to burn severely. They burned severely because the fuels and the canopies were set up to burn severely in many cases. Yes?
So as I live up on Balky and I have 20 acres, I had 20 acres of sagebrush. So when this burn gets into these overgrown fuels and starts the really severe burn, and then just because of the nature of the greasiness of sagebrush, it just keeps that speed going.
So is your question, once it gets into old sagebrush?
Well, yeah, well, once it gets into the steppe type of land, grasslands and sagebrush, coming out of those really heavy timber areas, it maintains its speed.
Depends on the fire weather circumstances and the stature of the fuels and how dry they are. If you're in sagebrush and it burned 5 years ago and you've got itty bitty sagebrush coming back on the landscape, it's not going to burn like old growth sagebrush that hasn't seen fire in 40 years. So the age of the fuel and the size of the fuel is going to influence the flame lengths. The wind conditions, the fuel moistures that are occurring, how much dead sagebrush there is, all of that factors into it. My understanding is that the severe burn periods were under an extreme backing wind. It was gusting over 50, wasn't it, Susan?
No, it's actually 25 to 30.
I mean, in the passes and stuff, the highest winds coming over 2,000.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So going along with that same question, can you speak a little bit more to the shrublands and the grasslands and their condition in these decades compared to 100 years ago? And does it have a significant effect on how they burn now, or is it really more, how those burn is really more dependent on a given time period and the weather and the wind?
So there's a lot you mean in the forest?
No, in the shrublands and grasslands, not in the forest. So, our history of sheep grazing and fire exclusion, even in shrubs and grasslands in our area, is that really making much of a change in how fire burns through those areas, or not so much?
It's made a huge difference. We have a lot of non-native grasses. We have a good example around the foothills in Wenatchee. Cheatgrass has taken over what was fescue and scattered sagebrush and bitterbrush steplands around Wenatchee. And so now we get a pretty continuous carpet of cheatgrass, which is a fuel that carries fires much more readily across the landscape and more quickly, and it promotes more cheatgrass. Where you've got cheatgrass in these hills, that's also true as well. My understanding of the fire ecology of grass and shrub steplands is that you also had fire size distributions in those types as well, and they were responsive to shallower topographic gradients. But fires were generally larger typically in grassland and shrubland. So my sense is that we have big punctuated events that occur that synchronize species composition, size, and age of the grasslands and shrublands over time, and tend to spread non-natives as well, because they've been introduced with the grazing. Did you want more than that, Julie?
No, I think I could, but to me, like what you talked about, what can be done in the forest, it seems like a harder question in terms of what can be done in the grass and shrubs. Around here, there are pretty significant part of our landscape, and a lot of people's homes are in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the increase in cheatgrass and other non-natives, it seems really daunting and overwhelming to try to curb that.
So you mean in terms of doing prescribed burning on the range?
Or anything, or any other kind of restoration.
You have somebody coming in your talk and talking about fire-wise landscapes and how to protect your landscape around your home and that sort of thing.
Well, the level of it for this class, we're not sure on that last day if we're gonna go in detail that or more direct people to take fire.
Good resources, okay.
Yeah.
Following up on that, are you familiar with the work of Alan Savory using grazing as a management tool?
I'm familiar with grazing as a tool.
Maybe you should talk a little bit about that, because that, as well as fire, influences grass and shrub steppe.
It's kind of a mixed bag, their role of grazing. Where you have, my understanding is where you have native grass communities, for example, and you have grazing going on, having excellent grazing management can be a tremendous influence, where you move the herds and follow the green up and have range riders that are making that happen, that it actually is really good for the range and it's decent for the fire ecology as well. But where you have really converted ranges, it's less clear to me how grazing fits in, because you have extreme variation in how heavy the grazing is by the operator and the effect of that grazing on the community. If it's a highly non-native community, it's very different than the native community. So grazing is a great tool if it's done right to mow the fuels down, and it's not necessarily harmful to the range at all. It can be done fantastically well. The problem is it really varies the effect. I will say that in the last 100 years, grazing management has, the quality of it has increased tremendously from 100 years ago. The worst grazing we ever had probably was between 1880 and 1895. The ranges were in the poorest shape, and in many ways they've actually improved. Our first lost species, extinct species, were being listed in the Senate record in 1890, 1885, and they were lost to grazing. So the soils are in better shape, grazing is done better, and it can really be a positive influence on the fuels that's done right.
How would you change the policy of putting out for wildfires? You've talked about the prescribed burning, but there's a component here of how you deal with wildfires as well, I imagine.
It's a fairly complicated recipe, but key parts of the recipe are having analysis on the shelf ready to go, knowing what the fuel conditions are and the pattern of the fuel conditions and the circumstances under which you can burn it safely and get the prescribed effects. So you can't just take ignitions and run with them. You want to have some clear idea under the fuel moistures and under the weather conditions how these fuels and these arrangements will burn. So it requires a decent amount of 8-hour analysis in an area. After that's done, we have tools for being able to measure fuel moistures by fuel particle size and make estimates of the kind of fire behavior and weather circumstances that we'll get. And if we have those key ingredients in place, we can actually take ignitions under relatively benign weather circumstances and push those fires around, herd them through those conditions and get the effects we want. Alternative to that, we can actually light the fires under more optimal conditions after we have that analysis on the shelf and get even better fire behavior. But that's the rough outline. We're not cavalier about it because a fire getting away is a serious thing. But those are the pieces. Fire managers are actually quite skilled at being able to do these things. Really good numbers are probably, I would guess, nailing it 85, 90% of the time, missing it 10% of the time. Those would be great numbers. Yes?
Where do you see commercial logging in this whole scenario?
I see it as a piece of the puzzle. I see it as necessary in a variety of places where you simply can't get it done with underburning, pre-commercial thinning, or fire-only treatments. Some places, the densities and the layering are so extreme that we can't get to the place that we want to get without doing some thinning, especially low and free thinning kind of operations, and they're commercial. Yes.
So, would you manage the forest to provide some limited logging availability into the future as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's an essential part of any recipe. I wouldn't say you give carte blanche to the landscape, but you actually do evaluations across the landscape to determine in each location, in each patch, where the best mix of tools applies. And then that's the toolkit that you apply. So it varies quite a bit across a project area, what you're going to use. Some areas you're going to burn 7,000 acres because these patches right here fit into a really nice project, and we're going to push fire around 2-3 times and take care of it with burn-only treatments. In other areas, we're going to do like John talked about, where we're going to go in with force account crews and knock down seed sap small poles and pile them, cure them out, and burn the piles. Do some broadcast burning. In other places, those tools just simply aren't adequate. They're not enough. There's too much fuel, and we need to be able, some places the species we even need to be growing aren't growing there anymore. And we need to regenerate the fire-tolerant species again. So there's a lot of careful analysis that needs to go on to determine what's the best combination of tools for the circumstance, for the patch. And that's the kind of thing that goes on in a large-scale landscape evaluation.
So do you think there could be a sustainable amount of logging for an industry out of this process?
Absolutely. Yep. The only way to do restoration on any scale is to have the infrastructure to support it in an ongoing way. Yes.
It seems surprising that prescribed burns would be a healthier way to reduce smoke and wildfires. And when we look at the Carlton Complex fires, we saw these tremendous smoke plumes going up many thousands of feet into the air, which disperses the smoke over a very large area. If you have prescribed burns, that smoke seems like it's nearer the ground for a longer period and thus lead to a more unhealthy effect.
Not necessarily. An awful lot of prescribed burning can be done during a window when you can get the smoke up and out high in the airshed. One of the things that's different, this is actually an area of yours, Susan, that you could talk to about the difference between wildfire and prescribed fuel consumption.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go into it in my talk next week, but I will say that there was a very different smoke impact with the tripod fire that burned 180,000, roughly 180,000 acres in over 2 months. We had some bad smoke in the Methow Valley, as I'm sure many of you remember. Whereas the Carlton Complex burned most of its acreage, about 200,000 acres, all in 36 hours under strong winds. So Carlton Complex had great ventilation, Tripod Complex did not. Most wildfires don't.
So on the subject of being able to save smoke, one of the things that happens under these these escaped large wildfires is that a lot of times the medium-sized and larger fuels, they actually ignite and they smolder, and that smoldering combustion is a source of a tremendous amount of unhealthy particulate smoke. When you do the prescribed fires, what you do is you burn the finer fuels such that they're not there and the larger logs can't catch on fire. And so you char the outside of the larger logs and they're left there to rot. It's the small fuels. It's just like in your fireplace. You know, if you throw big logs on the fire and put a match to it, it doesn't start. You need the kindling. If you burn the kindling out, it's very difficult to get the fire going. But if the kindling is there, it'll cause the larger logs to incandesce. And so one of the things you want to do with the prescribed burning is get rid of those 110, 100-hour fuels so that the larger stuff doesn't burn. And that's where the smoke savings is.
Obviously these fires are going on in mixed land ownerships, between the Forest Service and DNR and DFW and private lands. So with something like prescribed burning, I'm just curious, it seems if there were some changes in regulations on the air quality standards and that kind of thing with respect to prescribed fire, that could open things up, but are there places that have successfully done this, like on private lands? Are there contractors, that are able to do that kind of thing, and where they've been able to cross boundaries and do it sort of on a larger landscape level?
It's a really important question. John alluded to it in some of his, John Daly did it in some of his earlier comments. The Forest Service and BLM in Oregon, they're the agencies that are doing the burning right now. The state isn't doing much burning except Fish and Wildlife up at Sunhegan. The need is for us to start a much broader, more intelligent conversation among all the agencies that we've got intermixed ownership, and we have a fire problem and we have a smoke problem. What we need to do is turn a corner, and each of us have a stake in doing some of that burning and doing the preparation for that burning on state, fed, and private land. That conversation isn't going on, it's the one we need.
I wonder if you would apply your 4 key takeaways to the fires this summer and make an assessment of the fires this summer based on what your conclusions are.
Could you repeat the question?
In line.
The question was, in terms of the takeaways, how would I relate this summer's fires? It's hard to relate Carlton to a lot of any other fires. It's an extreme fire weather event that produces extreme results. In the forest, if the forested component was in the species composition, size classes, and densities that were typical for the fire regime, I think you'd have had some conspicuous differences in fire severity and effects on the soil. Some of the worst fire effects I've ever seen occurred in some of the dry forest. The range was not a patchwork of size and age classes of shrub steppe communities. There's a lot of old growth sagebrush and bitterbrush, and it burned like old growth scrub. Once again, it's one of those rare 99.9 percentile fire weather events, and I think it could have been less extreme, but maybe not less large as a consequence. I think it still would have been a big fire. Rangeland fires under extreme weather conditions are big, scary fires. And they burn sometimes 500,000, 1 million acres. They're very frightening and they move fast. But it helps to have a patchwork of fires and age classes across that same landscape. When we do reconstructions of fire patches in those same communities throughout California, for example, in their grass, chaparral, and woodland communities, we see across the 20th century the same patch size distributions that I showed you. So they're a part of the range community as well. And I think they would have had effect on fire spread rate and severity as well. That's about what I have to say. Yes, sir.
So the prediction that we're likely to have more extreme fires and people on that in the future, climate change. Is it possible we need to reevaluate the historic patchwork that you pointed out earlier to deal with this?
That's a great question. We actually are doing that. And yes, absolutely. We're looking at climate change analog conditions to see what their patch size distributions were, and we're finding out that they are nudged in the direction of larger fires and a slightly different patch size distribution, but the patch size distribution still confers resilience in those communities as well. The question becomes, as the climate warms, are we going to see anything like we've seen in the last 500 or 1,000 years? And depends on the model forecast that you look at. Some of them say that it's going to be pretty serious, and some forecasts say that it's nothing like we've ever seen in the next year.
But won't the same principles apply?
The same principles
Still kind
would
of do the
apply,
same things?
but we wouldn't observe history anywhere near as much. We'd be looking at the kinds of we'd be looking at it as a problem that we want to remove the most deleterious effects that happen with climate warming, bigger and hotter fires, and still do the best we can for species. And it may not be in the recent historical record any of the recipes that we find. Yes?
Are exotic species a larger problem or a smaller problem after fires? Do they get the upper hand after fires like the ones we've seen here and like some of the ones you described, or the fires tend to open the window back up for the natives?
It sort of depends on what sort of non-native species problem you have before the fire. And it depends on how good, if you reseed after the fire, how clean your seed mixes are, if you do any seeding. But it's generally related to how bad your problem was and which species you had before the fire. Most of the non-native species are habitat generalists and they're disturbance increasers. So when you get a fire exposing a lot of mineral soil, you have an opportunity for them to outcompete the natives pretty often.
I'm just curious, this may not be a question for you, but if you look at, just fire strategy on like a forest-wide level, if we were to look at this area in the Okanagan, like, is there a plan that the Forest Service has about, just strategizing where they would do mechanical treatments or prescribed burns or whatever from like a risk assessment perspective, from like infrastructure and looking at hot spots, whether it's vegetation, under a certain condition, and actually addressing those areas through kind of a fire management and forest, management
There is.
strategy? Okay.
The Okanagan National Forest has a restoration strategy, a landscape restoration strategy, and it's through its second revision, and it's available online at the forest website. And there's a landscape evaluation process that's ongoing on the districts now to do that very thing within groups of watersheds.
Yeah, I'm just curious because I think I have seen that actually, and just the restoration. Yeah, I don't know. The areas that seem to be a focus they didn't necessarily seem to have anything to do with infrastructure and the rest of the community, but I might be wrong on that.
You probably want to talk to a local about, are you thinking of a project on the district here? Or?
No. Oh, yeah. I've just seen through the, I think it's the Northwest Forest Health Collaborative, they've given presentations on their restoration strategies, but I didn't know how directly that was related to kind of like a community-wide forest fire strategy and that kind of thing.
I don't think that that's happened yet. Do you have any projects? South Summit wasn't designed under the strategy, was it?
No, we're starting.
Your first one started?
Well, I have a meeting down in Chelan with the collaborative. That first project is called Mission Project. It's Libby Creek and Buttermilk Creek villages. That's using this process that Paul is talking about, evaluating the landscape. But as far as, you should talk to call somebody at the ranger district, say you want to talk to the fire management officer, and ask them if there's a specific plan. I think the forest has some plans as far as when it comes to fire suppression and different things, but I don't know what they call it. As far as, where they're going to fight fire, how they're going to fight fire, and you're talking about infrastructure and values at risk. Yeah, they have that stuff. I can't think of WFS. You do what's that, a wildfire
escape strategy.
Yeah, but they have a process when you have a fire, and all the infrastructure and all that stuff is in a database. So when you actually have a fire, you'll have a team and they'll go through and try to figure out what's happening. So I know that data's there.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking not so much like during a fire,
Right.
but like the proactive part of it, to be dealing with that stuff ongoing,
Yeah, you should talk to some people in the fire management shop because they actually have been prioritizing the landscape. Like Paul talked about, is that we talk about the wildland urban interface. And so where the national forest land meets the private land, we have a process where they prioritize areas that they want to treat. Basically, the idea is to keep fire from like coming from off the forest onto the forest, or from from the national forest onto the non-national forest land. I mean, that's the ultimate goal.
The lab is actually working with the forest right now to develop a prioritization tool, where to go first, second, third on the forest, and then a local landscape evaluation toolkit that allows them to actually set those priorities for how to influence large fire travel and vulnerability of the landscape to fire and successional patterns, those kinds of things. So we're actually implementing it on all the districts right now, and like John said, the local district here is going to start its first project here this week.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be really helpful to know and be able to, like, with the Conservancy and larger land holdings and that kind of thing, be able to work together and potentially even increase the area of
Sure would.
impacts, you know, from those efforts.
I have to just mention that the restoration strategy that the Okanagan Wenatchee National Forest has is almost one of its kind. It's so innovative and so progressive, and we really expect that it's going to be a case study and take hold in other districts and other national forests around the country.
Yes.
Yeah, good question probably on the pre-settlement fire regime. That seemed to be what you would consider the balanced ideal model. Is that correct?
It isn't in our restoration strategy. It's useful for me to tell the story of the direction, the magnitude, rate of change. But in our restoration strategy, we're actually using the historical conditions to find out where we came from, and we're using climate change analog conditions to find out where we're heading in terms of patterns.
So would you say that left to its own, we didn't come here as settlers, would the forest tend to have an encroachment pattern and fill in those areas eventually by itself if there were no major fire?
So would encroachment be the rule if there was no fire?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Tremendous encroachment. You saw it in the 30s to present photos. Yeah, doubling, tripling of tree cover in a lot of areas.
Right. So
We
is
have-
that
we've done-
Idaho burn, 1914, whatever it was, kind of like an illustration of that?
The 1910?
Yeah.
1910 was a different box of rocks. There was a tremendous amount of railroad logging and high grading of western white pine on the Idaho Panhandle. And if you see some of the early photography of that logging, the amount of slash in the busted up forests were spectacular. And the fires burned really super hot and big through that area, and that got the most press. But if you look at the ignitions that occurred from the 1910, that particular summer, they were scattered. Zillions of fires throughout Oregon, Washington, and California. And everything focused on what was going on in that panhandle country where the big fires, you know, were spectacular and burned large areas. But there was actually a larger area scattered across the west that was burned that got no press at all. And it actually burned pretty close to the way it should have back in 1910. So what burned really hot and nasty was a consequence of just heavy selection cutting and heavy slash loads in areas that, and then just a mud kicking fire going through that field. Sure.
I wonder if the probability of a fire like the Carlton complex might not be a whole lot larger than the tiny number that you told us. And the reason is, when I think about the causative factors like the very dry conditions, the very high temperatures and the high winds, these are probably not uncorrelated variables. And whenever you have correlated variables, probabilities tend to be much higher than otherwise.
The likelihood of those fires is actually really up. So if you heard that it was down, it was a tiny probability, then you heard wrong. Because of the fact that there's been so much change and the climate is warming, those two combinations are creating kind of a perfect storm condition for larger and more severe fires. So the likelihood of larger fires is up.
Well, they get misunderstood, but 10 to the minus 4 probability is not the current or the future probability that you would estimate.
No, that's not. That wasn't a probability. That was a size. It was 10 to the 4 hectares. So 10,000, 100,000 million hectares. So that was just an exponent for the size of the fire. So it wasn't a probability distribution. It was a frequency distribution of fires by their size class. Okay. You have a question? Anybody?
You talked
urban forest interface and the need to protect it. And which is an educational thing for people to protect the property and to reduce the amount of fuels. But we noticed like Lightning Creek Fire, what was that, 10 years ago, 12 years ago? Upper Valley, immediately after that, there was a community at Lost River that was heavily threatened. And everybody up there is doing fire-wise protection. You go up there now and there's unburned piles that they left from the
That was both question and answer in the same. Very efficient. How are we doing?
We're about there.
I think we're there.
Thank you
Thanks
so
very
much.
much for the great questions.